Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to Health and Wellbeing Live, sharing knowledge and experience from Nottingham City. Keeping people informed about issues, people and services supporting health and wellbeing in the city of Nottingham. So this is a relaxed podcast style production pitched at an interested and informed audience. We're not going to be dumbing down. We want to have real in-depth conversations about the issues that matter to health in Nottingham. But they are open to anyone to listen. So if you founders, then sit back and enjoy. Today we're talking to Hugh Porter, who is the Clinical Director of Nottingham City Place-Based Partnership. But just so you know who I am and what I'm involved in, I'm Dr. Andy Foster. I'm a GP partner. I'm a Director at NCGPA, our local GP federation, and I work in inequalities at place-based partnership level and with our local PCN. But welcome, Hugh.
Welcome, Andy, and thanks for having me. Really looking forward to having a good chat.
Yeah, and I understand you're nearly on the cusp or just about to retire, so it's a really good time to get you on a show to talk to you, and so you can talk to the people and professionals in Nottingham about your career and what sort of experiences you've had and what sort of knowledge you might, wisdom you can impart for people. So, do you want to begin by just introducing yourself and your current role?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Hugh Porter. So I'm a GP at a place called Cripps Health Centre at the university. And as Andy says, I'm shortly to retire. But for the last couple of years, I've been the Clinical Director of Nottingham City Place-Based Partnership.
Wow, so you've been very busy, and I know that you're quite well known to most of the people, most professionals, I think, working in general practice in Nottingham City. There's probably a lot of people out there who aren't aware of you and the work you do for place-based partnership now. But I'm quite curious, actually, to know where things started for you in medicine and how your journey to where you are now. I don't know if you can outline that for us, please.
Yeah, of course I can. It's been a great journey. I'd say it's coming to the end. So I'm a Yorkshire lad from Hull originally. At the end of A levels, I went to Leicester University. Stayed there for 6 years. And at the end of that, I was absolutely sure I wanted to do general practice. I really loved my general practice attachment, and I thought this was definitely the sort of place to be. And I was fortunate enough to gain a place on the Nottingham VTS. In those days, there was a lot of competition. Nottingham was a very popular place for vocational training, but I was lucky enough to get a place, so I spent sort of 3 years doing the VTS. Interestingly, my first placement was at Cripps Health Centre, where I became a partner. So the first 6 months in Nottingham at Cripps Health Centre, I thought, this is just a fantastic practice. And I just love student health so much. I love the vibrancy and the challenges of all these young people. So I did VTS. Went to Australia for a brief while, just a sort of little sort of surgeon, sort of back down under, but then I came back and became a partner at Cripps in 1993. As you can anticipate, the first couple of years were just finding my feet as a GP, getting my clinical skills up to sort of scratch. But after a couple of years, started to think about broadening out, and I became the lead partner for sort of liaison with the university. Obviously, partner very, very closely linked to the university, so that brought me a bit into the management world. And at that time, higher education was expanding massively. We've got 70,000 students in the city between the two universities these days. And I had a feeling that sort of the needs of student wasn't really being heard by the NHS sort of in the late 90s. So I sort of started to have interactions with the FSHA, that's as a precursor of these NHS organisations, and then the PCT saying, actually, we need to start thinking about sort of the sort of needs of students. As you raise your head above the parapet, people say, oh, you're interested in doing some management. Would you like to do a bit more management? So then I got sort of pulled into the sort of management world a little bit. In 2006, the government sort of set something up called Practice-Based Commissioning, or PBCs. And some of our older colleagues may remember across the city, we developed 4 PBC clusters. Norcom, Unicum, sort of City Central and Robin Hood. And I was lead for one of those, and that brought me more into the management world. 2010, Ansley Lansley announced the NHS reforms, and it felt a bit like everybody stood back and I was just stood at front. oh my God, where have we gone? When they said, who wants to lead this new thing called the CCG? So I was fortunate enough and supported by some brilliant colleagues, both clinicians and management, to sort of form this sort of city clinical commissioning group of CCG. And obviously I was chair and clinical lead for that until it sort of ceased in 2020. Obviously, sort of halfway through CCGs, the NHS change sort of system started to kick in again. We had STPs and integrated care partnerships and the merge of the CCGs. So I was involved in all of that. And then in 2019, it was pivotal in setting up what we'll probably touch on a little bit, Nottingham City Place-Based Partnership. And I had a fantastic 4 years at this tail end of my career working in the sort of place-based sort of space across the city.
Fantastic. So I understand how you got to where you are now. I know the first time that I sort of remember sort of seeing you and becoming aware of you was at the CCG, as it was then, Nottingham City CCG biannual general meetings. And it was, I found actually the leaders there at the time, including yourself, were really open to talking to, who was then a new GP, and actually found quite an inspiring presence there, Hugh. So
there's a kind words, and actually the biannuals were great events, isn't it? Because I think, and one of the things of trying to sort of keep beyond the CCG is that sort of sense of sort of city general practices as a unit. Because I think, most of my colleagues are really passionate about the city and the sort of people they look after. And interestingly, obviously, when I first got into this world, there were probably 65, 70 practices across the city. Obviously, they've come on, sort of merged and changed, and probably down to about 45, 46 at the moment. But that sense of city general practice, and actually, many people have heard this across various situations, making sure it had a proper voice in the system. It's something I've always been passionate about.
Yeah. I certainly feel that's something that's potentially been lost over the recent years. We've kind of lent towards remote communication, remote meetings more, and that feeling of connection and being a community. And also actually as someone who became interested in leadership through not necessarily the contact within the meetings with leaders, but that contact just outside, before, after, chatting. I feel that that's potentially been lost for the new leaders coming through, but I guess that's something we might talk about later. Hugh, you did mention, or we're beginning to talk about some of the changes that you've seen over the years, and you must have seen a lot of changes. What would you say are some of the bigger or biggest changes for health in Nottingham? Either the health of the people, I'd be interested to hear about that, because that must have changed in terms of what comes through the door as a GP, and then also the organisational and kind of structure side of things. What changes or events have you seen?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because there's both been massive change, and you do sometimes feel the sort of pace of change has continued to accelerate through sort of my career from that point of view. I think you break it down into a variety of sort of high level pieces, really, from that side of things. If we think what the NHS, both local and nationally, whatever, delivers, compared to the sort of late 80s to what we do now, is just a quantum change. When I started, if you had an MI, well, you were admitted for 5 days and you had a bit of diamorphine. Think of where we are now as an MI. It's just what happens in the NHS and what it delivers is just a quantum change from that side of things. And that's had a huge influence on this sort of, what's happened to the health of people in Nottingham. So, in the early days, cardiovascular disease obviously was by far the massive killer across the city. It's still a big issue. Let's not be out of bush. It's still a major issue, hypertension stuff. But actually now, of course, it's neck and neck with cancer. And actually some years cancer being a bigger killer for the city, because the NHS has had some great successes. So there's been that sort of change I've sort of seen. I do think how we interact with our people, with our citizens has changed. Their expectations has changed massively. I certainly see that on the front line when I'm in surgery. I'm sure you do, Andy, as well. I think all professionals in the system probably feel that. The internet's had a huge knowledge. That sort of patriarchal sort of respect for or medicine. I think rightly has changed. It should be much more balanced co-production with people we're seeing. And I think that's been a good change, but it creates its challenges for us. And there's been some other bits as well, I think.
Hugh, can I ask a question? You mentioned technology a little bit there, and a memory I have of you is sitting next to you somewhere, and you were telling me, you might not remember this, but you were telling me about a smart light bulb that could detect when people had fallen over. So I sense that you've had an interest in technology, going through, and I was just wondering, what you think has been the biggest kind of technological change in how we access health, either biggest for us as how we deal with health as professionals, or that's had the biggest impact on people. Just curious.
So I'm quite interested in tech, actually. I also sit on the call of Clinics of Health Council, and we've done a bit of work on adoption of AI in health, for instance. I actually think it's not pieces of kit that's had the biggest difference. It's data and data quality that's had the biggest difference. And, again, when I started in the early days, of course, it was all handwritten notes, the Lloyd George or whatever. We moved through various clinical systems. Hospitals are starting to move that. I think Nottingham's been a forerunner with eHealthscope. Hats off to Mike and Neil. We've now got the systems analytical information in it. And actually, the biggest change is actually we have such a lot of good data to help us do things better on the other side of things, okay, and to guide us better. Yes, we've got smartphones, we've got the NHS app, they're really critical from that point of view, but it's actually having high quality data and using it in a sensible way, because that delivers real big differences to the population.
Absolutely. And it sounds like I interrupted you and you were moving on to talk about some other things, Hugh. So feel free to resume and carry on.
I think the other thing I was just about to touch on, what the biggest change is. And again, this is quite strategic sort of stuff, but you don't sometimes sort of think about it in your day-to-day sort of life when you're sort of seeing patients. But of course, just not something else. The sort of purchaser provider split, so the politics of the NHS. So I've lived through that purchaser provider split where we had providers, we've had competition, and there was, that was an ideological sort of piece, which, we're now, I think, sort of through things like the ICS, through the place-based partnership, starting to move away towards that more integration working way. So almost like in the late 80s, we didn't have the purchaser provider sort of split. We've had a generation of that, and now we're moving away from that, because actually people said actually in the modern world with the 21st century challenges we face, that doesn't actually deliver what we need to deliver from that side of things. So I think it's it doesn't always feel tangible, but that ideological change I think is really pretty substantial, particularly when we will get to the going forward piece, which I know will probably come on to at some point.
Yeah, excellent, good insights. So I guess it's now the 4th birthday of the place-based partnership. Happy birthday, place-based partnership. And that's been some of the more kind of recent part of your journey, hasn't it? But a lot of people out there might not fully understand what the place-based partnership is, what it does. So I wonder if you could just give us an outline of what it is and why should we be interested or should we be interested?
Yeah, and actually it's I'm proud of many things in my career, because I've had a fantastic career, but I'm absolutely proud of these last couple of years and what we've done really from that point of view. So as we moved into this world of STPs, integrated care systems and stuff, there was a realization that actually place was really pivotal to how you could deliver on the challenges we were facing. And what we needed to do was to move the NHS in all these components into a different space. So the NHS is national, it tends to be sort of a reactive service historically from that point of view. And it sort of has historically, sort of generally worked by what we call the deficit model. By that I mean the NHS will say, we've used some data, we've identified a issue, we'll put a service in to solve that issue. So that's a deficit model, which is entirely appropriate for a lot of things. You've got appendix, you see surgeon, used to have see surgeon have the appendix out, you don't anymore. Again, that's some of the changes we sometimes see. But what we now know, actually, particularly because a lot of health issues are driven by the wider determinants, most of the colleagues listening will have heard of the wider determinants point of view, you need to think a bit differently from that. So you need to think about an asset-based model to say, actually, with our communities, if there is an issue, how can we help our communities do it? Ideally, solve it themselves. If not, how can we work with them to design the services needed to solve it? So moving to an asset-based thing. And the place-based partnership is trying to take the local NHS into that sort of space, which requires it to work both with its wider partners, particularly the voluntary sector, particularly the local authority, and also reach out and work in a different way with our communities. So in 2019, we brought various components of the NHS. That's the primary care networks, which include GPs, Nottingham University Hospital Trust, Healthcare Trust, Nottingham City Care, that's a community provider. But we linked up with the local authority, we linked up with some voluntary sector, obviously we linked up with NCGPA. So we linked up with a whole load of partners to say, okay, this is a space we need to move into. But the current challenge is none of us can solve the issues. How do we work together to try and solve them in a different way? And that's what the place-based partnership basically is. And over the last 4 years, we've been taking that concept and trying to make it real, which sounds easy, but it's hard. So there's a sort of famous sort of quote is, if you think sort of competition is tough, you should try collaboration. There is some truth to that quote.
I certainly emphasise with that as well, or empathise. Gosh, you mentioned quite a lot there, really. I'm just wondering what are the priorities currently for the place-based partnership? And I don't necessarily just mean the clinical priorities, but in terms of you making things happen from and within that organisation. What are we looking to see next from the place-based partnership, or kind of where are the priorities at as you step away?
Yeah, so I mean, over the last 4 years, again, we've been on a bit of a journey. So when we started pretty small, but it was very much a learn by doing sort of piece. We said, let's not be sort of go for perfection, because you never know. Let's just start doing some stuff, build some relationships, because we know in this sort of space, relationships are key to success. Yes, we can talk structures, and structures are important, but relationships are probably the most critical into success. So we started fairly small, looking at things a little bit like sort of smoking in pregnancy, flu. We started some work on what the original program was called Wellbeing, Health and Inequalities. Actually, this was interesting before Black Lives Matter came along. Really important issue for many of our communities across the city from that side of things. And then we built on that. And then sort of more recently, we become the delivery vehicle for something called the Health and Wellbeing Strategy. So many colleagues, but not all, will know that every sort of local authority has to have something called a joint health and wellbeing strategy. It's a legal requirement, and that was refreshed last year by the ICB and Nottingham City Council, and the place-based partnership is responsible for delivering that. And that really has sort of 6 sort of key areas. So one is something called severe multiple disadvantage. That's for people who've been in contact with the criminal justice system, substance or alcohol misuse, domestic violence, homelessness. So there's a group of people who have severe multiple disadvantage. We know they have very poor outcomes, and they create a lot of challenges for the system. They touch a lot of bits of the system, so that one move. Smoking or tobacco control is still a massive issue for the sort of city. We often think that sort of relates to that sort of historic John Player roots in the city from that point of view, obviously. Eating and moving for good health, because we know that's absolutely sort of critical. And again, that's something that really plays into the place-based partnership space, because that's not just about health stuff, it's about your built environment, your transport system. open spaces type things. And then slightly differently from most health and wellbeing strategies, but given where we've been, where we were, was financial wellbeing. Because again, we know if you haven't got enough money to heat your house, you haven't got enough money to eat, surprising, that has a pretty substantial effect both on your physical and mental health.
But I'm just wondering, as you step away, what do you see as the future of or for health or healthcare in Nottingham City? What is round the corner, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question, Andy, isn't it? And I think there's a whole lot of ways you could cut answers to that. I think there's a couple of sort of pieces if you think about it, really. So we've got an election coming, like it or not. So that's going to drive the N in the NHS quite aggressively over the next year or two, both in terms of pre-election and whoever gets in will want to demonstrate they're doing this stuff. So I think there will be a huge focus on what matters to voters. Understandably, that's what our politicians are bothered about. They want to get elected. So there'll be a huge focus on, obviously, elected care, elected backlogs. And there's a lot of work going on already. Not surprisingly, Acute Trust particularly are working, phenomenally hard to try and make some inroads into what is a hugely challenging number of citizens. And for us GPs, there'll be continued fairly laser focus on access, because when people knock on the door, they still get I can't get an appointment with my GP, or it's challenging to get my appointment with my GP. When we're talking GP, we'll hopefully increase, let's say, the wider primary healthcare team with all the different roles we have. So that's going to be drive a sort of short-term sort of NHS focus. And alongside that, the NHS will have a pretty sort of tough stance on the budget, because actually they're in not a very good place throughout the country. So those are sort of three things that will drive the NHS, and most of that's entirely appropriate. So we'll see stuff that will drive in those agendas, but actually I hope, particularly through things with place-based partnership, yes, we've got to deliver the here and now for the NHS, but actually won't get completely distracted by all that, and actually we'll still have some time and space to sort of do the sort of work that it's doing now, and that's sort of in sort of that wider determinants piece. How do we make the lives of our people sort of better? How do we sort of try and get into those wider determinants? As you're doing, how do we sort of think about health inequalities and inequalities in a different way, and actually try and get into some of that sort of space, which actually will involve how some of the money is spent, and how do we move from that, as I said at the beginning, the reactive NHS type model into a bit more proactive sort of space, and doing all that in a way that actually is meaningful for our workforce. I think our workforce has had a horrendously tough couple of years, and my hats off continue to everybody's efforts and work they did. But actually, we're still feeling the consequences of that. And whatever we're creating, we've got to make it professionally rewarding and sort of bearable for sort of people going forward. And I think those wider, deeper themes is something that the place-based partnership will be wanting to really lead for. In addition, again, we touched at the beginning in terms of trying to make that sort of asset-based thinking rather than deficit-based thinking more within the DNA of the NHS. It's in the DNA of the voluntary sector. It's more than DNA of it, but actually, the suggestion we need to try and make sense. It's something that becomes more naturally to us in the NHS. I think will be sort of one of the challenges going forward.
Yeah, that's really quite inspiring actually, and that asset-based thinking isn't something I've heard a lot of before, but it makes an awful lot of sense, and it's also good to hear about that shift to prevention rather than tackling problems in the here and now. After they've developed, yeah, I think we really need to move in that direction as well, and actually a lot of the strategic movement is in that direction, which is positive.
Yeah, and I think the problem is, well, a couple of things. and we've talked about the data, we do have the good data. We've got to create the capacity to use the data. We've got to somehow create the capacity for frontline staff. So yes, we do deal with the here and now, but actually they have capacity and time to actually think about that proactive way. We can't just add it in on top. We've got to change that sort of system of how they work. And I know one of the things a place-based partnership will be doing is working with PCNs through what's called a Thriving General Practice Programme. That's a programme we've had of bringing the PCNs and practice together. So, you know, many of the challenges you face as practices are sort of similar. Actually, yes, the ICB has a primary care strategy, we have the national stuff, but actually what can we solve as a community of practices? What can we take control of to do that? That's a Thriving programme, and I think the Thriving programme will help some of that sort of thinking about new models and how we do it.
Yeah, and I've been part of that programme, and it's actually been really good that the place-based partnership has been able to create space for those important conversations about how primary care and general practice develop going forwards. As you say, you've got to create space to use the data, create space to to manage and drive the change. Yeah. So I really appreciate that Place has been doing that.
Yeah, and it's one of the things early on in my management career, one of the pieces of advice which I think is really important for anybody really in that leadership space is it's very easy to pack you down with a zillion meetings and pieces, but you sometimes got to create some space just to think. And that thinking space is really important. The more strategic you get, and it's easily gets written out for your diary, but actually just creating some thinking space and some reflection space is really important.
It's really good, yeah. So, and I think for a generation of people coming through who are interested in NHS leadership in Nottingham City, you've been somebody near the top of the pile to look up to. How do you think we can effectively encourage the next generation of leaders for health coming up through Nottingham City and more widely?
Yeah, I think it's a really valid question. It's certainly sort of that succession piece is something I've been passionate about throughout my career. I think it's so important to sort of pull the next people up, if you see what I mean, Andy, from that side of things. And I think it's about creating some of the right opportunities. So in my journey, I started on fairly small scale stuff. I remember one of the earliest things I did was open access MRIs. We were the first place to get open access MRIs for headaches in the country. And often as a sort of clinician and care professional, that sort of pathway, sort of clinical piece work is quite a good way into the NHS management and sort of certain things. It's an area you know stuff about. It's not too foreign because the management stuff, whether you like it or not, has its own language and terminology, and medicine has its own language and terminology. But actually that sort of interface, perhaps some sort of clinical pathway work is a really good way into that. And then actually, it's important that the more senior leadership recognise that and try and sort of support that in terms of further opportunities, is to get involved in sort of slightly broader pieces of work, maybe occasionally a bit of committee work from that point of view. Obviously, we have things like sort of Health Education England, Phoenix programme, and actually then also working with that sector, which actually does get quite a bit of money from the central government, to say actually how can you use your resources to support sort of development of people as they get into that more management space. And for instance, in the early sort of 2000s, I did an MBA. I did that off my own back because I'm doing quite a lot of management here. It'd be quite useful to do an MBA, but actually there's a whole lot of other sort of potential courses lower than MBA, but it's still sometimes quite useful if people are wanting to get into that. And again, working with assistants, saying what are the opportunities for that, I think it's quite important. And realising this takes sort of time when people do need support. Again, looking at mentorship. I think is really important for that side of things. Many of you know Sonali Kinraid, who was a GP in Hucknall, and is now down in London. And Sonali had a great sort of program of sponsorship for women who wanted to go into leadership. I'd be part of that sort of program. And it's really important to have mentorship or sponsorship, because actually it can feel a bit sort of daunting for sort of young colleagues entering into this world. And actually, we can open doors and help them in that journey. And I'm very keen. Something I've always tried to do, and I know people like yourself and who say Margie, who step into my role, are passionate about that as well, Andy.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you've frozen, Hugh. No. Tim will have to edit that bit out. You look very still for a second. Sorry, give you some work to do, Tim. Okay, let's pick it up again. So, thanks for all those insights, Hugh. You've always seemed, at least from afar, to have things together and be, very effective. And you mentioned one of the tactics there, just making sure that you have time in your diary to think. Are there any other practical tips for people to be more effective in the leadership space or achieve more as you've done?
So there's lots of tips, but if you had to sort of say one piece that I think was quite important, because you talked about sort of, the biannuals you used to do and sort of stuff. I think sometimes one thing that is easy not to do well in this sort of management leadership space is listen properly. So actually, often in this space, it's about bringing people together, overcoming sort of potential or sort of barriers from that point of view. And you can only sort of do that and lead people if you really listen properly to where they're coming from and what their concerns are. And I think sometimes, and I think we see that in society a little bit, people aren't listening properly to each other. And one of the things I try and practice is really quite active listening to say, let me just understand you, let me think about this. And also then recognise that as a valid place for them to be. You might not agree with it, but I think that I understand. I now understand where you come from. I can understand why you hold that. So let's start to have an adult conversation about but there's people over here who hold a different space. Let's try and work that through. But that active listening, careful listening, I think is really, really important in being an effective leader, because actually then people will feel listened to.
Good. And that may be a good place to people who've been listening intently for probably about 30 minutes now. So that may be a good place to start to wrap things up.
Yeah.
But Hugh, what we're trying to do in these interviews is ask every guest, you've got an opportunity. There are a number of people still listening, hopefully. What action would you like them to do next? Having listened to you for a little while, what would you like them to do now? It might be read something, it might be look something up, it might be watch a video, it might be do something. What would you ask people to do?
So if I had one sort of thing that people should perhaps have a read or somebody they should get to sort of look at. He does TED Talks as well. There's a guy called Cormac Russell, and he is a real champion of this asset-based space I'm talking about. And one of the best books I read, probably at least in the last decade, if not more, it's one of the books I read and I felt really inspired by it. It's a book called Rekindling Democracy, a professional guide to working in the citizen space. A little paperback book, he does a TED Talk on it. I'm sure we can put a link up to it, but Cormac Russell, Rekindling Democracy. It is just an inspirational book for particularly people in the NHS to say, this is a space, if we want to make the health of our people, the citizens, better, this is where we need to be going as the NHS. And it's a great book, highly, highly recommended.
Good. I will pop that on my Amazon shopping
list.
Other booksellers are available. Hugh, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's been really great to learn more about you and the journey that you've had, your perspective on how things have been and how things will be in the future, and those tips on leadership as well, and encouraging future leaders. It's been absolutely fantastic. And also, I guess the city will probably be taking a few opportunities to thank you for the service, really, because you've had a long life of service to to your patients and to the people of Nottingham City. So on behalf of everybody, if I'm allowed to do that, thank you very much, Hugh.
Thanks, Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure to be on the podcast. It's also been an honour to be in the leadership space that's supported by so many brilliant people. The classic line is standing on the shoulders of giants. So I've certainly stood on some real giant shoulders. So it's been an honour, and hopefully leaving it in a good place with people like yourself and the same and the rest of the Place-Based Partnership.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you everybody for listening. Goodbye and catch you next time.